Welcome to The Secret Life of Data, where we pull back the curtain on the human stories shaping today's data landscape. In each episode, we sit down with leaders and innovators who are navigating the complex world of enterprise data, exploring their challenges, breakthroughs, and visions for the future. From global banks wrestling with data access to airlines transforming their analytics capabilities, we dig deep into the real experiences of organizations balancing security and innovation. Our conversations go beyond the technical specs to uncover the human elements, the frustrations, the aha moments, and the lessons learned along the way. Brought to you by Velotix, pioneering intelligent and secure data access for the modern enterprise.
Hi, everyone. David Aronson here from Velotix, kicking off our episode of The Secret Life of Data with Stephen Gatchell. Stephen, we got a chance to chat last week. I had a great time. You told some fabulous stories, and I'm actually really excited for this episode. Stephen, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the audience?
I work for a company called BigID, which is a late-stage startup right now, and we basically are looking across the data space and understanding your data from a data discovery and classification point perspective. I'm sharing that because all day, every day, I talk about data strategies, AI strategies, things like agentic AI, and all these lovely terms that keep popping up. Before I joined BigID, I was actually executing things like data strategies across companies like EMC and Dell and Bose. So have had the small company experience, the large company experience, but my whole career, that red line, if you will, across my entire productivity is around data itself.
Yeah, and when we talked, one of the things that you shared was around sort of like this difference between smaller businesses and these like super large businesses. You've worked really, all kinds of different places. I mean, you've worked like IBM as far as change management is concerned. That's going to be a massive place. And you highlighted change management as one of these like key differences, when you reach these size organizations. And I think a lot of people listening here do come from these much larger organizations. I think change management's a huge issue. So I wanted to just ask you specifically, what is it do you see in specifically in data? Just give us some examples of like what is so challenging about the change management, both from the data itself and any initiative you're trying to run.
Yeah, I think data specifically, one, people don't tend to understand it or think they understand it. So imagine going to an executive and saying, we need to invest in data management. And their response is, well, why? We know our data. We already understand it, right? And so start that conversation with the executive and then go all the way through the organization to data engineers that know that the senior executives don't have any clue what they're talking about when it comes to data or data use cases. So it starts there. So you have to be kind of a brave soul, if you will, in the data space, because you have to have conversations and understand both at the kind of the technical level, what are we trying to do with this thing? What is the value of data? Very tough conversation around the value of data and how to measure success, if you will, all the way up through how do we get our executives to understand on the business side, the differentiation that we can have against our competitors by using data. So when you talk about that scope, change management is a critical component of that. Who are your proponents? Who opposes things around data? Who thinks they know everything versus they actually don't know anything? And what kind of education are you going to have to do? How do you speak their language? How do you know what they're being compensated on and what their goals are? Right? So when you take all of that into account, it has nothing to do with data. It has everything to do with personalities, styles, complexity of what they're trying to do, level of the individual, how to speak to that level of individual. That's all change management stuff right there.
But there's something you mentioned about like specifically nowadays, the pace of change has accelerated so much. I mean, we talked about projects that like sometimes, you'd be in a project for years and years and years. And now all of a sudden your CEO shows up and it's like, we have to just drop everything that we've been working on. And now we have to focus on a new project. Maybe it's Gen AI, maybe it's something similar to that. What kind of havoc does that, wreak on the people involved? And how do you manage that?
Yeah. So you can always be nervous when an executive gets on a plane and they start reading their news feeds on LinkedIn or whatever. And they start reading about things like, say, agentic AI, which is the favorite topic of 2025. Or a couple of years ago, it was generative AI and the advent of ChatGPT. And I actually literally had a customer, we were working on a data strategy for, a good 6 months to understand from an end to end. And then come January, this thing called ChatGPT and generative AI pops up and the entire strategy is scrapped. So think about time, effort, materials, cost, vendor relationships, all that stuff across, consulting and technology. And when you talk about data, you have a security perspective, you have a privacy perspective, you have a data perspective, a technology perspective. So doing a data strategy is very time consuming for a lot of people that have a lot of things to do. And to be able to take 6 months of work and throw it out the window, and now all of a sudden you have to kind of refocus. Now, the good news in that scenario that I just gave you is that obviously a data strategy is related to things like generative AI and agentic AI in today's day and age. It just may change what your priorities are. It might change the business use cases you're trying to execute. It might change the focus of the data sources that you're focusing in on, things like that. So I think the way to manage that is one, if you're in the data space and technology space in general, you better be able to, change on the fly, literally sometimes hour to hour. So that's one. The second is keeping up with the latest technology to understand, well, what does that actually mean for your business and for yourself and for your coworkers is the second challenge. And then the third is, how do you actually formulate these messages and turn it into applicability, quite frankly, for your own business strategy? So as long as you work with those individual teams to show that not everything that they've done literally gets thrown out the window, even though that's how it was phrased, but how it can apply to this new technology, and then show the opportunity. I mean, think about generative AI, and it's not just data people that are using that. It's grandmothers, it's students, it's grandfathers. It's like everybody's using this stuff. So it's super cool. So you reframe it and say, this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing.
Yeah, it's like all of a sudden your grandmother's like, "Wait, I I do know what you do for a living.
It's
You
like
do that
grandma.
thing where you make the fake words that do the" yeah.
I really like your lasagna, but I asked ChatGPT what's the best recipe to make lasagna, and it came out better than yours.
Now that's heresy. Be careful with that. You can't our traditions, this is our food we're talking about. But to that point, everything is changing. Everything is changing because it can and because we're aware of it, and you can't stop it just because you have, some priorities that you've been working on until now. The organization is what it is, and the priorities that they list are what they list. But let's talk about change in general. I think around data itself. So the data itself is also changing. There's more data types that are popping up. There's different elements of the pipelines that we're developing and building out and having to really maintain and handle the issues involved with it. As the data side, there's regulations that are constantly changing, and also we as businesses are growing and moving into different areas, and our different strategies are always changing, which means even if we weren't doing so much business before in Germany, now we are, or the states that matter across the United States. Everyone's coming up with a new privacy law. It's happening so fast, and our policies have to adapt so fast, and it's really hard to do. And people, let's say you've figured it all out, right? Your people are changing roles. What they have to do in their roles are changing and developing. So we're talking about a moving target on shifting priorities. So my question is, how do you actually make this change happen without just knocking into walls all day long? Like, you don't have 3 years to try to build out some agentic AI, initiatives. We don't have that kind of time. How do you do it?
First, you have to have clear messaging and making sure everybody's aligned. So to your point, there's so much different types of data out there. So first of all, you have to make sure that you understand those different types of data. So in the past, structured data was a focus. With AI, unstructured data and things like vector databases and AI models now come into play. And AI models are just like code, right? So it's a little different than your old AI models where you're feeding in data and the AI model may actually have data inside of it, right? So understanding the changes around the data space, understanding who actually generates the information. So things like business processes, nobody wants to map out a business process, trust me, but understanding how to do that and where the data is being created, then how it's being transformed, then who has access to it. To your point, you brought up policies and regulations. Understanding, for instance, what is the difference between the standard regulations, and everybody hears about GDPR and CCPA, right? Because those are the two older ones, if you will, now, believe it or not, even though it's a couple of years,
True.
to things like the EU AI Act, where there's language in the EU AI Act that says you can't do harm to humans from a model. Like, that's a much different conversation than saying protect Stephen's email address and personal information. So understanding what these changes are, utilizing the quote unquote experts in the individual fields, because again, data is another thing that's so complex. If you tell somebody I'm a data expert, like what the heck does that actually mean? You have to have a privacy expert. You have to have a security expert. You have to have a quote unquote, data scientist or analyst expert. You have to have an IT expert that understands the tool sets themselves. So it really does take a village, and AI is really forcing the cross-pollination of these teams coming together. Whereas with regular data in the past, you had these silos. Like privacy would go off and implement the tool and say, "Oh yeah, we're doing assessments, right? Privacy impact assessments. We're good on privacy." And then security would say, "Okay, we understand breach response. We're good on breaches." And then data scientists would say, "Oh, okay, we implemented a technology and we're storing all our data in here. We're good on the data side." AI doesn't allow that. There's so much different data types and data and business use cases and the applicability of compliance and so forth across all these different policies. It increases breach landscape. So how do you minimize your risk while still actually accelerating your innovation? It takes all of that. So I think a couple things is being very clear and concise on what your business use case is and how is data and AI and technology going to help solve that business problem. That's one. The old boring role and responsibility to understand who owns what is extremely important, because once you actually implement these things, especially in production, who's taking responsibility for it is the second piece. And I think, I'm a little bit biased here because I work for a technology company, to be perfectly transparent here, but utilizing the right technology, once you've figured out those first two pieces, can help accelerate and actually take a lot of the stress and pressure off. I'm not going to say technology is going to solve every problem, because it never does, but it can help automate a lot of the things. And I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll stop on this point. When we talk about generative AI as an example, years ago, you would have people creating business glossaries in an Excel spreadsheet. So you have a data steward and they say, define customer for Velotix. What does a customer mean here, right? Is that a prospect? Is it somebody that's actually paying for something? Is it somebody that's just doing services, or they bought the technology? Whatever the case may be. So you define it on a spreadsheet. Then you get the cross-functional teams to actually agree to what that means. And then legal comes and says, we don't look at a customer in that terms of definition. A customer is a legal entity that blah, 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 blah. Or marketing, right? A customer to us is somebody that we actually send material to. So you have all these different dynamics. I think with the advent of generative AI, as well as the scanning and classification capabilities that companies have, technology like Velotix, right, where you can go into role-level accessibility and understand the data, if you will, you now have the capability to actually create the business context for all this stuff. It's no longer just the technical metadata, it's the business metadata. So how do I use generative AI to actually implement the business side of things and don't have data stewards sitting there creating a manual business term on a spreadsheet? Like, this is good news, by the way, right? You don't
Yes.
want manual stuff.
Yes, yes. It's basically the way I kind of imagine it is it's basically like every single way that we handle that last mile of saying, well, what data do we have? And then who can have how can I give that maximum data set? Let's go back to that Gen AI use case, right? If I don't have a maximum data set that I can use safely, then I'm not going to reach the goals that I can reach otherwise. There's just no way. I may not even know if I could reach those goals because I couldn't even discover what I could do, which data I could get. So I think just to go back to that idea that you just shared, like that access thing, I kind of imagine like in this like role based approach, role based access control. I think everyone talks about. So when you actually do this role base, what you're doing is you're kind of looking up and saying, who is this person? But instead of looking at this person and everything inside of them and what they might need around the data that they might be wanting to use, it's kind of just like it's marketing. And even within marketing, like you said, like there's different definitions of customer, different definitions of use cases, and then sales, and then like there's so many different contexts. So in today, we can start using things like we talk about like attribute based access control so that we can actually get more granular. We even talk about, Velocix, we do a lot of this, is like the policy based access control is like, how do we translate this? Like you talked about like AI for in the EU, it's like oh, do no harm to humans. Well, how does that translate? Like, I'm sitting here, I'm a data, steward, and I have to now like figure out, okay, well, what do I write here for the permissions for who and how? Like, I don't even understand it. This isn't even English, right? So, like, and then you've got like your own internal legalese that's supposed to turn it into something that's more actionable, and maybe it's made it even more vague. So there's a lot of like last minute stuff where it's like, wait a second, maybe we haven't set it up so that we can now run really fast and do what we need to do with it. But of course, that's where vendors like us do have the kind of opportunity to really show what we can do now, not just like another project you can do over the next 6, 12, 36 months that can help you with some of your long-term, midterm goals and maybe even get some quick wins. Like, no, this is called, how do we get our work done now? So like one way to get through these walls is to literally find a new framework where they're not really walls anyways. They're just new ways for us to understand who's who and how do we get this business done. But you had mentioned in our conversation last week around like the kind of person that it takes to succeed in this role, the kind of not just characteristics, but like the kind of outlooks and the different ways to be. You mentioned empathy and some other ideas. Can you share like how do you see like the most successful people? What makes them successful in this role?
Grit, knowledge, and empathy, right? So those are the three I think I mentioned last week. So break each one of those down. I think grit, for anybody that has been trying to manage data, especially data governance is a phrase, right? Where years ago, it's just pushing boulders uphill because it's looked at as a cost center. People don't understand the use case and the value. It's very hard to put a number on return on investment on a specific. So if we comply to all of these regulations for data, then we won't get fined. Okay, so those are kind of soft costs, but I think companies are in denial that they'll never be fined. And we're seeing, and there's actually websites that track all the different fines across GDPR and others, which is very interesting. And some of them are very, very high in the billions. Now, data governance people, as an example, are having their day in the sun because guess what? You stick AI on the front of it, and all of a sudden everybody's like, we need AI governance. Hey, no kidding. So what is AI governance? And then people are like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know what AI governance is. And then you come to them and you say things like, and this is where the knowledge part comes in, understanding what data governance is, understanding what AI
Mhm.
governance is, and then mapping them together to say 80% of AI governance is actually data governance that we've been talking about for 20 or 30 years now. Whereas AI governance has these few different little components, like different regulations, perhaps, or you mentioned frameworks. There's so many frameworks out in the marketplace now to understand how do you actually implement a framework to comply to the regulation. So a knowledgeable person that, one, can understand the deep understanding of what they're trying to do with data. And that could be governance and security and privacy and all that fun stuff. Or on the data science side, understanding the business context and use case, and then how to apply it to an actual model, and then be able to story tell how that model is going to actually deliver what the business uses. These conversations can be extremely frustrating because people aren't speaking the same language, quote unquote, because of things like business glossaries. One of my favorite things is when somebody comes to me and says, we need data lineage. My first question is, well, how do you define that? Because there's this thing called data mapping, which is the privacy perspective. You have data lineage, which is the technical perspective, and everybody's defining it differently. That's where the knowledge comes in, to really be consultative, to ask the right questions, to have the courage to ask for context instead of just jumping in and trying to give answers to somebody that may not actually be using the right terminology. And then the empathy comes in because you have all these people that are running 1,000 miles an hour. And then they're asked to do something else, and they're asked to do something else. I mean, data stewards, I keep going back to them because that's a classic thing where data stewards are always hired on a part-time basis. I shouldn't say always. Most of the time are hired on a part-time basis, and they have 15,000 other things. And then they're blamed because there's poor data quality in the data sets that they're supposed to be storing, as an example. Or you get a data scientist that has 15 business units asking for 1,000 models, and they're two or three, the scope of the team is 2 or 3 people, right? So I think the empathy part comes into play around understanding the complexity, understanding their perspective, understanding some of the challenges that they're trying to overcome, so that even when you go as a data person and you say, we need a data discovery tool and I need X number of dollars for it, and the executive says you can't have it, have the empathy to really sit down and find out why. So maybe the company's not doing as well and they're not profitable and they're either going to have to lay off people or they're going to buy a new tool, right? Or maybe you can buy a new tool and make the ROI use case to actually save those people's jobs because you can generate revenue from that new tool or whatever the case may be. So understanding the root cause analysis, having the patience and the empathy to not just get aggravated by the words no, but finding out why that no came up, and then having the I'll go back to the grit piece, the grit to actually roll up the sleeves and go back to that person and try and help them solve that problem. And that way they can solve your problem too, right? So those three perspectives.
Yeah, knowledge, grit, and empathy. Well said. And I think like that empathy piece, obviously it's very important. We don't get things done with other people, without it. But if we're talking about trying to move faster than ever before, and we're trying to bring more people into that change management story, then we need to understand what our underlying story is going to be that brings everyone together. So to be able to, like you said, understand the business context where before everyone talk, you need business context because that's what you're doing. You're solving business problems. But we've all worked with people who, there's business problems and then there's business problems, I'm focused on this one, but what about the context of it? So to be able to really find the underlying story that brings people together to achieve this new thing means bringing people into the broader business story faster in less time and helping them draw those connections between what they can do and what they can achieve. These are skills that I think when a lot of people think of like data people, they think of like nerds and they think of
Yep.
like, I don't know.
Fonts.
Right. But it's a people oriented, or not just a people oriented organization, it's a people oriented function. People think of it as data function. It's a people function too.
Well, who's generating all that data?
Exactly.
People.
Exactly. There's a
So
reason why it's so well regulated, right?
Well, think about social media, right? I mean, people are generating all this data that then is converted into algorithms to try and get value out of that data. And so if you don't understand what the underlying business problem is and how to solve it, but then storytell in their language. And by the way, the same story might have to be translated into 3 different languages or 4 different languages. What I mean by that is you can't just go and say, we're going to solve this problem on the privacy perspective and talk to privacy about, okay, we're going to help identify and accelerate the recovery from a breach. Especially if you're talking to a chief privacy officer that might be a lawyer, they're more interested in like, well, I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on getting a regulatory fine because we're using our customer data incorrectly and a right to be forgotten process is not very good. And therefore customers are actually suing us. Like, so how do you take that solution and apply it to that privacy story and then switch the story to the security to talk to the CISO and then switch the story to talk to the data scientist about how you accelerate their time to using data. But then the underlying foundational capabilities, it's all the same stuff, quite frankly, right? And then, starting out with knowing your data and classifying your data and then, understanding entitlements to that data, all that stuff, that's all foundational to any of these use cases. And so a little bit of data literacy comes into play here. How do you teach at I'll say 3 different levels. I always put them into 3 different levels. The executives where you have maybe 30 minutes to tell them the data story and how you're going to tell them the value of it in 30 minutes or less. You've got the individuals that are managing the people that are hands-on keyboard doing the work day to day. So you need to go a little bit deeper into theirs and tie the business use cases to the technology for them and how that technology is going to enable them to be successful and create services that their businesses want to actually sign up for. And then you've got the deep level understanding. What I love is I do some teaching at Northeastern, and one of the professors that I know very well, it's teaching data engineering, brings me in to talk about data governance. I love that because if I talk to data engineers in the field, in the customers, they have no clue what data governance is. And when you start talking about regulations and all this stuff, their eyes might glaze over a little bit. But if you say to them, if you take this stuff into account, then down the road, it's going to save you a ton of time. You're actually going to get your stuff into production versus being blocked by security or privacy. And in the long run, you're actually going to save yourself time by putting a little effort up front of what you're doing from a data transformation or ETL process and complying with some of this stuff. And they don't need to be deep subject matter experts on this. They just need to understand like, hey, there's regulations there. Go talk to the privacy team, tell them what you're trying to do, and see what kind of guardrails you need. That's what I'm talking about, right? And start this cross-pollination conversations across these different disciplines.
Yeah, I think it's really well said, and I believe also like our role as a vendor, I think allows professionals as they advance through, in their careers to be able to kind of see because we're looking at not one organization how to solve them just one organization. We're looking at that same story times many, 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 many times. And we're consultants will have like, as many organizations that they'll work with. What's that like 5, 10? I mean, how big can they get? Like we're working with, hundreds, thousands, and all kinds of different scales. And I think one of the perspectives that we can help each of these data, not just executives, but like all the way down, just help you understand like what is possible. What is possible when you have these like older systems or older ways and you're inheriting them at the end of the day and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I now unlock new things? And you've got like, I'm trying to like imagine someone who's like digging down as like an archaeologist, you get like, the higher levels, all look new and then it gets older and older and older, right? And you kind of like have to run all of it and you have to kind of align on these new initiatives. And I was like, oh, right, data governance. They talked about that once. I remember it was important, I think. Pretty sure it was, right? And it turns out it's not just all these different pieces if we don't look at them in silos, but we look at, and this is really the premise of this podcast itself, the secret life of data is when you start thinking, what's behind that data? What's the organizations behind it, the individuals behind it, the people who created it, the people who we are obligated because they created it to protect what they've created and protect their privacy in that creation, and for us to be able to be creative with that data that they created so that we can now go and advance and use this to be able to make everyone's lives better, whether it's our own customers, whether it's our colleagues. Like you said, sometimes like, times are tough and if we can't get these initiatives out the door, someone else will, and that's going to affect bottom line and it's going to affect our jobs and everything's at stake all the time in the good times and the bad. So a lot of this context that was maybe behind the scenes and like maybe, some more advanced conversations or people complaining about the corporate, like, no, it is all one united thing. And the more that we can do to have this united conversation with each other on the same topics and not start driving off at the same time. Yes, understanding we do have to drive off into the world of the privacy people who are worrying about the next thing that could happen if we didn't think about this right and are worried about our data consumers so that they make sure that they get the data they need when they need it, how they need it, and everyone in between. So, yeah, I obviously couldn't agree more. There was something also that you mentioned about the data community as being I don't know if it's necessarily so unique to this community per se, but something that is not all common everywhere, where people are able to really share the things that they've learned in a context that actually lets other people learn when sometimes there's issues around what I mean, so like I can't share everything in my business, right? But you mentioned that people actually can in different ways. Can you tell me a little bit about like when you go to events, like kind of what that camaraderie is, right? I mean, I know when we go, people love seeing each other and there's this like great energy in the room always. So I'm curious from your perspective, like why that is.
Yeah, I think one thing is even though we talk about data everywhere and all things these days, the actual community of people that are consistently quote unquote thought leaders or attend, conferences around the globe, literally, it's amazing who you run into at these things over and over and over again. So one, I think there's this group of data community that we're on LinkedIn with each other. We see each other at conferences. We may dial up somebody because we're trying to solve a problem. We know that person solved the problem. And for one, have not run into anybody in my network, quite frankly, that where I've picked up the phone or shot an email or shot a text or whatever it is, where I don't get a response. And to me, that is just amazing. Now, in the world of data, you have these frenemies, if you will, right? So you have partners that could actually be competitors and so forth. But I've always found like even if you call up somebody from one of these frenemies, so to speak, you don't have to give away trade secrets. You don't have to give away a customer name. You don't have to give away differentiators, but you could talk about conceptually what challenges you're trying to solve. Somebody somewhere has probably done it before you. And so one, I find you're not alone because there's a good community, close-knit community that you can reach out to. The second, to your point, when you actually see people in person, they generally seem to be very pleased to see each other, which is amazing. They want to go out to dinner, they want to have a cup of coffee or a drink or whatever it is. And that doesn't happen in other industries that I've had the pleasure of working in. So I don't know if it's just the mindset of people crazy enough to be inside of the data space, and therefore need the camaraderie, need, those sessions together to kind of feel like they're not alone, all that good stuff. Or it's just the simple fact that we have very challenging jobs that you can't just solve these problems very easily in one click of a button, so that we know that we need help, and therefore we're going to help somebody else, even if it's from a selfish perspective that someday they may help us. I don't know, but I think the secret sauce of people in data I've found is pretty awesome. I really do enjoy going and seeing people at conferences and in person. I think the amount of use cases and the insights to those use cases, they are critical takeaways in a lot of these presentations that can get you at a minimum started in the right direction. And so again, it's not like you're giving away the secret sauce and you're telling them from A to Z on exactly how to do things, because you don't have the time to do that in those settings anyway. But to post something on LinkedIn when DeepSeek comes out and everybody's freaking out about DeepSeek, and you spend 15 or 20 minutes saying, hey, think about this angle instead of this angle. Again, you're not giving away trade secrets here. You're just helping people. And at some point, that's going to pay back. So I always start with, is the person a good human being? Yes, check the box. Okay, cool. Let's link in. Let's meet each other at conferences. Let's grab a drink or dinner or whatever, and let's build a relationship. And I found that's worked for me.
Yeah, and ultimately, just knowing other people who go through similar challenges that you do, especially in a world of such complexity, especially in a world of such change, everyone's going to have their own unique experience and stories to share. So, like, oh yeah, I installed a program once. Like, no, everything, everything that someone has done is interesting and is relatable. Question: what books are you reading today?
It's of course about AI and data, because that's basically my focus right now. I think in the data space itself, there's many good books out there, and it just depends. Honestly, I think you have to think about the topic. Like, there's so many different categorizations and so many good books around things like, okay, data valuation. Think about putting data valuation on a spreadsheet. Sorry, on a balance sheet. That's much different than perhaps some core data foundational versus, we mentioned agentic AI. So yeah, I apologize. I can't think of the name of the book off the top of my head, but maybe we can share that as we post this video or something. I'll give it to you.
Yeah, and we'll have to make up with like a full page banner or something to promote it. Yeah, absolutely. So what other podcasts are you listening to?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff, quite frankly, I find on LinkedIn. I think there's an amazing amount of podcasts, but also just little individual things. There's a woman called Allie, and again, I'll give you her last name so we can promote her stuff too. But there's certain individuals I follow versus generalized podcasts. You have to just kind of find those individuals of that specific area that you want today, and that might change a week from now. But it changes every day. I mean, think about DeepSeek, right? So think about how that's changed our whole conversation. It affected the stock market. Okay, it affected the way people think about, Nvidia, who has increased their stock 8 times over the past couple of years, and now all of a sudden that could actually impact how we use electricity and the amount of electricity. And we see these companies that they want to spin up, new power plants, because they need the electricity to run AI. And then here comes DeepSeek, and they're all of a sudden saying, no, we don't need those high-powered chips anymore. Yeah, we created this model for 5.6 million versus, $100 million or whatever for other models. So I just think you got to figure that out. But I will say I do spend probably at least an hour a day, whether that's first thing in the morning, or I need a break to just get away from meetings in the middle of the day, or perhaps at night to wind down, to figure out what is going on in the world. And you can use generative AI, by the way, to do that for you. You can actually use things like ChatGPT to say, hey, summarize all the events of agentic AI today and tell me what I should look at and things like that. So I'm kind of quite frankly, all over the map to answer you. That's the long answer to your short question.
Stephen Gatchell, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for watching, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for joining us on the Secret Life of Data podcast. To learn more about how Velotix is helping organizations transform their approach to data access and security, visit velotix.ai. And don't forget to subscribe to catch our next episode exploring the human side of enterprise data.